Hello, I'm Sue Mather from Gallaudet University, the Department of Linguistics. I'd like to welcome you all to this presentation by the Clare Center. I am thrilled to be here because all of us share the same passion, which is to help students improve their learning experience. Now I'd like to talk about three topics. What is split attention? How does split attention impact student learning? And what are the two visual fields? I'd also like to talk about strategies for reducing split attention. Now I'd also like to talk about the importance of visual learning and just how powerful it really is to student learning. When a student experiences split attention, this means that the student can't focus or handle multiple pieces of information being delivered, and that impacts learning and understanding. This photo is a perfect example of the importance of visual learning. Statistics show that students benefit from visual information 55% more than spoken or textual or signed information. Now I'd like to talk about visual props and how that correlates to visual information. You may have seen, in general, various schools in your area that have visual props or aids. They could be presented in the form of pictures, maps, globes, or science. Anything that can be used to help students remember better. Now let's look at what is meant by split attention. I'll use this video clip as an example. And there are three things to look for: the projected presentation, the interpreter just under it, and the speaker to the side. There is no audio in this video. Imagine yourself as the deaf or hard of hearing student. So there you have it. Can you imagine? Hearing students can rely on auditory information and attend to the projected presentation slides and listen to the presenter at the same time. For students who rely on visual information, they're working doubly hard, and that causes an extreme amount of split attention because the student cannot visually attend to the interpreter and the projected presentation slides simultaneously. This next slide shows that there is a need to reduce the amount of things to attend to. You have the presenter in this picture. You have the interpreter on a separate screen. You also have a picture of a graph, and you also have text. Does this seem like it would be helpful or beneficial to deaf or hard of hearing students? So this is another example of split attention, and students are left with the decision to decide where to attend to in order to learn. And that has an impact on their visual learning. So split attention impacts students' visual learning. In fact, let me give you some examples to show you how. Take a moment to look at this picture. Try to remember as much as you can. Now, can you answer the questions posted here? How many strings of beads do you see? And what color were the beads? That's difficult to answer. And this is an example of how your working memory can't handle too much information. Third, we're going to discuss how to reduce split attention. Well, if you look at this slide, you may feel better and understand why you may not have been able to memorize what the beads look like, what color they are, or how many there were. This is an example of working memory. So as you can see, your working memory is absorbing a lot of different pieces of information. Lots of different information is coming at you, and you have to screen out what's important. Let me take a moment to explain actually how the brain works. So, this word, cognitive overload, is an important word, and it's a perfect way to explain what happens with split attention. For example, the brain works in such a way that it can take in information using short term memory, which is then placed into working memory, which allows space for more information then to be taken in. Once a concept is understood, it's then placed in long term memory. As seen in one of the previous slides, suppose a student is taking in information and then is asked a question at the same time. The function of the working memory is compromised because of split attention. I have another example, which is very similar to the previous ones. Look at this photo of the shapes, and I'd like for you to see as much as you can. Now look at this next question. Which shapes do you see? This is very difficult to answer, and this is another example of split attention, of trying to take in different sources of information within your working memory at the same time. I'd like to show you another example. And this photo is not bad. It could be better. This design still forces students to have to split their attention. They have to determine which word matches which shape. The fourth slide is even better. So this is a great example of integrated information. You have both the word and shape integrated, which reduces the potential for working memory overload. Now I'd like to talk about another example, how to integrate visual information, particularly when instructing in a visual language like ASL, while at the same time presenting visual props. And here's another example. You see integrated text and visual prop, which is demonstrated by using the arrows and the numbers to guide the learner's eyes in a circular pattern from one information point to the next. And the whole visual prop is set up to encourage retention. Let me show you an example of a visual that does not use integrated text. Again, here the student would have to look at the text on one side before looking at the picture to be able to identify which is the right answer. So just as I had showed you in the example with the shapes, it's difficult for students to learn, understand, and memorize information when the information is not integrated with the text and the picture. This is another example for managing students' visual access. Using the fingers is a great tool to mark anything that you might be instructing. So, for example, you have the four rivers listed here on this map. the Potomac, the Rappahannock, York, and James. You then create a visual method to identify the names of the four rivers, which helps in student retention. Now that I've talked about what integrated learning is, it's equally important that you all understand what the two fields of vision are. So I'll show you two things. The first thing we'll look at is the vertical field of vision. This image here shows that the general field of vision in which a person can take in visual information. One vertical field comprises 70% of the information, another comprises 50%. In the horizontal field of vision, you'll notice what the eyes generally can see, being represented by the colors red and blue. These lines represent the student's field of vision. For example, the left eye has full visual access of information being received at about 60% to the right of them, as well as 100% of what is directly in the middle, which is very important. The same is true for the right eye, and this convergence or overlap of visual fields creates the horizontal field of vision, which can be used to maximize visual access. In general, in public schools, the classrooms are designed in such a way that the students are seated in rows so that they can attend to the teacher at the front of the room, and often the teachers are presenting information in written form on the boards. And let me show you an image to demonstrate that. So as you can see, the teacher is writing on the board and speaking at the same time. Also note the space in which she is writing. She's actually writing the equation above her head, and that's actually so that the students can access the visual information. So as you can see, the students have dual access to the spoken explanation and the math prop. The written element is important to students' learning. They learn how to write and formulate math equations so that they can learn to work independently and do their own homework. Now, in this slide, you see two types of dual access. Okay, in the previous slide, we talked about dual access for the hearing student. They're able to attend both visually and auditorily. They're looking and listening while the teacher is presenting the lesson. Now, for the deaf or hard of hearing student, there's double visual access. They're looking and listening with their eyes. These students can take information in doubly. For example, a child can watch TV and work their eye gaze back and forth between the closed captioning on the television and the action on the screen with ease. Now, let's take a look at how teachers can ensure that there's visual access. So look at this student's visual access to the book being read to her. And here is an image to show you what that looks like. In general, for a hearing child, they can access the reading of a book by auditorily listening and visually attending to the book at the same time. For deaf children, you can also do the same thing by integrating the signing with the text in the printed book. Now, in the next slide, we're going to talk about what this looks like in a classroom. The teacher is looking across the entire group of students to ensure that all students can see her, the picture, and her signing. Now let's look at a diagram of the students' lines of visual access and ask ourselves whether each student has visual access. This photo shows that indeed each student has full access to the fields of vision in order to see the teacher, the picture, and her signing. Take a moment to look at the photos on this slide. In the first photo, you see the teacher checking to make sure that all students have visual access in terms of where they're sitting and where she's presenting. And in the second photo is an image of her turning to the board to write. And take note here, in the third photo, she shifts her body and eye gaze to ensure that the students at the farthest end of the room can see both the information on the board and access her signed message. This is an example of what teachers need to be doing to ensure that students have access. You shift your body and your gaze to check on your students' visual access. Or you could even suggest that students rearrange themselves in order to gain more access. In fact, ensuring that students' seating is properly arranged before beginning class is best. I've just talked about how to ensure that students have visual access to the information being signed by the teacher and the information presented as a prop. Now I'd like to show you some strategies for integrating signed explanation and props within the student's eye level. So another strategy for doing that in terms of writing math equations is very similar to the example that I had showed you with the instructor who had written the math equation on the board and she was writing it above her head and also saying it at the same time. For deaf students, you can do the same thing and just adjust your approach a little bit. And what you can do is write the equation on the board and then sign the equation very close to the board. Make sure that all students can see that. Another example is show the students the equations on the board, give a signed explanation, and ensuring that they have time to view it. And make sure that you sign above your head, just as the other teacher had done. And also ensure that the students have visual access to both you and the equation that's written on the board. Notice in this slide the sight line shown here. That shows the teacher's sign for water, and she's pointing to the spelled word on the board. So this is another strategy for teaching in a deaf and hard of hearing classroom. Notice that this is different from the approach with the math equation where the teacher can essentially sign in proximity to the math equation in a linear fashion, but rather this teacher signs water and points to the word. And the teacher is using proper sight lines to ensure that students can see both the signed explanation and the prop in their field of vision. This is an example of a teacher creating a level field of vision for students to access the lesson. As you can see, in this next photo, the teacher at the forefront of the photo has shifted his body and sign space. And he's looking at the student to ensure that the student has dual visual access to both his explanation and the visual prop. Look at the next slide. So as you can see here, even in a science lab experiment, the teacher's strategy for ensuring students' visual access. He shifts his body and his hands closer to the experiment site, and he looks at the student to ensure access. And the goal here is to reduce split attention. This is different from what you see in a mainstream public school where teachers can both present the props and speak at the same time. And the students access information using both their visual and auditory sources. For deaf students, they utilize dual vision to access information, which is essentially the same way that hearing students are accessing their lessons. Now let's look at this video of Ron's classroom. The lesson is called How Many Shoes Can You Count? But first, I'd like to go ahead and play the video just quickly, and then I'll show you the video again slower in the next couple of slides.
Here are the shoes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
One, two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
7 and 8.
Okay, and on this next slide, there are many things happening in the room. And let me bring your attention to a few important strategies being used here. In the next slide, you'll see that the teacher, using his eye gaze to ensure access, is explaining to a student that her shoes are the same as what's in the picture. Please view the video and note that there is no voiceover. So again here, the teacher continues to use eye-level communication to ensure that all students have visual access to his signing and the shoes that he's pointing to. He's demonstrating that her shoes are the same as the ones in the picture. And moreover, eye-level integration is really foundational to all types of environments, including schools, meetings, and it's not limited to just children, but to those of all ages who rely on dual visual access to gain information. I'd like to take a moment to continue looking at this strategy. Look at how the teacher is signing and counting right next to the picture. And notice that as the teacher is counting the shoes, he skips a number, and the student, the same girl whose shoes were used as an example earlier, got up and corrected the teacher's miscount. He had counted 7 shoes, and the student counts along the picture with her hand and counts 8 shoes. The teacher acknowledges that he was wrong, which is a great tactic for increasing students' confidence in their schoolwork. The student clearly understands the lesson of counting, and she is counting. And notice that the teacher is nodding his head each time she counts as a strategy to visually affirm that she's counting correctly.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
One, two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
7 and 8.
So the student is telling the teacher that there are actually 8 shoes, which is evidence that she understands the lesson that she's learning. Now I'd like to share some tips for reducing or preventing split attention. First, you need to evaluate each student's vertical and horizontal field of vision in accessing you as the teacher. Second, before you begin your lessons, determine each student's visual access to the teacher's signed explanation and the visual prop. And third, before you begin your lesson, ensure that eye level between the teacher and the prop are integrated. And this was shown in the example of the 3 photos, and you see the teacher who shifts her body and her eye gaze to ensure that all students have visual access to the information that's written on the board. And that's very important. As instructors, you have to be consistent in ensuring that your students have visual access. And now the next slide. Points to remember. First, split attention causes an overload of the student's working memory. Second, integrate the teacher's instructions with relevant props. And third, make sure that every student in the class can see both the signed explanation and the props. So that completes the presentation portion, and we are ready for your questions. Go ahead and type your questions. We'll give you about 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll come back and try to answer your questions as best as I can. Thank you, and I'll see you all in just a few minutes.
Okay, the first question, how can we integrate signed explanations with visual props and interpreters in the mainstream classroom?
Certainly, that is a challenge when you have an instructor at the front of the room, an interpreter, and materials to be looked at. And these are issues that cause split attention. Interpreters often can make adjustments by working with the instructor. Sometimes that means actually sharing space at the front of the room with the instructor so that you're in close proximity to the instructor and the presentation.
Follow-up question related to interpreters. What can the interpreters do to help minimize the split attention?
This requires that you work very closely with the teachers. You may want to have some discussion with the instructors before class begins and find out how they're going to be presenting information. So for example, if you're working in a science lab and you're going to be working with experiments, you may want to create a plan with the instructor in terms of how you're going to set yourselves up in order to interpret the experiment so that the students have full access. Also determine where the teacher will be sitting or standing. Also make sure that you adjust yourself so that you're in proper visual sight lines for the students. And also in cases of the teacher writing equations or writing information on the board, one option is to actually stand next to the instructor when they're writing on the board and sign very closely using the board and the written materials as a prop. I also would recommend that many of you get together as interpreters and talk about possible strategies.
Next question. For my oral students, is it fair to say that this still applies to those who use lip reading cues? And also, could you repeat what you said about closed captioning? Is it or is it not impacting split attention?
Okay, so you have 2 different questions here. First, I'll respond to your question about closed captioning. And that certainly is something that's very important for us to think about. What's amazing is that the students or children are able to read the captioning and also attend to the action on the screen. And that's because the information is integrated. It's because both the captioning and the action on the screen are within the student's or the child's visual fields. And that is what creates an environment where they're able to absorb all of the information and reduces split attention. Now, your other question about working with students who rely on speech for instruction. Maybe they're actually looking directly at the instructors, but if they're not, I think it would be important to have a conversation with the student, and that is certainly a challenging experience. I'm wondering if maybe you could actually bring your props and even your signing messages close to the mouth so that the students can actually rely on your speech while you're presenting the information. That certainly is a challenge, and I think that we could look more into how we can reduce split attention for those who rely on speech for information.
Could you talk about the impact on working memory if the children you're working with have attention disorders?
This is certainly a common experience, and I have had conversations with students who have attention difficulties. And some of the things that I've learned is that the environment needs to be visually quiet. And if the environment has a lot of visual information around the room, that can become distracting. I'm sure that has a similar impact on students who can hear, who also have needs for attention. And I think that we could also look into that more further.
Can you speak to reducing split attention or promoting dual visual access in the context of teaching in classes like physical education or where you're in really open spaces? For example, I teach students how to ride motorcycles.
Oh, I would love to take your class myself. Could you give me more of an idea of how you're actually presenting the information, if you could, at this moment? Oh, I'm sorry. I was just informed that there's no way for us to actually have a dialogue. However, you may if I envision you talking about the handlebars and the brakes and how to use that, I would recommend that you actually place yourself and your body and your interpreted or signed message very close to, for example, the handlebars, if that's what you're focusing your lesson on. And use the handlebars as a prop, and also talk about how to use the handlebars and the brakes right there in proximity of the prop. Try to think of some other ideas. That certainly is a challenging one. How about if you were talking about how to use the gasoline tank? I would also place yourself close to that area when you're presenting that information, and ensure that you're using eye level signing to the prop or to the motorcycle in the area that you're talking about, so that students can see what you're saying and the prop at the same time. And I hope that helps.
A clarification to that question came in. Talking about environments where students are in motion and really very active.
Not sure if I'm clear on that question. Are you meaning like in a PE classroom? If you are, I would envision that you would actually work very closely with the student and walk around with the student, so you're able to be very close to the student when the teachers are actually giving instruction, so that the student has has you in close proximity.
In the concepts presented here, is there overlap when reading aloud to deaf children, or is that another completely separate issue or discussion?
Yes, as mentioned in my presentation, integrating that information, the signed information and text and picture, is critical to learning for everyone from infancy to adulthood.
Is there any way to enhance the teaching props? For example, can we include a copy of the teaching aid to each student, or would this be too distracting?
That's a great question, and certainly that is a piece to split attention and could cause split attention. I think it would be best if you were to show a picture in proximity to yourself. Or if there is a PowerPoint at the teaching wall, if you could actually use the PowerPoint as an aid and point to it as the teacher is giving the lesson. For example, often when we have meetings in my department and we have materials that we actually need to look at, we have agreed that we project the materials on the screen and we're able to read it on the screen. And if someone has a question, that they actually use the PowerPoint presentation as a prop to point to the question so that everyone has eye gaze to the question. Maybe there's some feedback that someone has in the department about something that is on the PowerPoint slide. So we have this member actually approach the PowerPoint slide and point to the question that they're talking about and have that discussion. Maybe there's just some editing issues or correction in minutes, but the fact that someone can come close to the visual aid to have that discussion reduces split attention.
When a reading teacher asks the class to look at a text as she explains it, what should the deaf student and the interpreter do so that the student can refer to the text but not lose the teacher's explanation?
Okay, so before I answer your question, I just want to let you know that we have time for one more question. But this question about reading is very important. I'm glad that you've asked this question. It's very difficult for students to look at text and at the interpreter at the same time, and that certainly is an example of split attention. So what some people have are specific pieces of technology where they can actually put the book into projection on the wall or on the board so that the deaf student has that visual at the front of the room, also providing time for the student to look at the text and then go ahead and interpret the message. And this is true for students who can hear as well. They also need time to look at the text before the teacher gives any explanation in terms of what the text is. And so you can actually use the written text as a visual prop and become very close to it as you're signing the interpreted message. And you remember that one example where the teacher was counting the number of shoes and very close to the picture. And that helps to guide students in terms of asking questions. If a student is not sure about, say, a question on number 2, they can actually point to number 2 and say, I have a question about this. And that way, all students and the teachers are all attending to that specific question or comment. So I would strongly recommend that you often use numbers and a numbering system in order to guide students' attention to whatever may be discussed in the lesson.
Okay, the last question. You mentioned evaluating a student's vertical and horizontal visual range. Do you have a successful way to obtain that information, or could you talk a little bit more about how you evaluate a student's vertical and horizontal range?
This is the last question, and clearly a very important one. When you begin class, look at where your students are seated. And suppose you have your math equations on the board and you have your students seated in front of you, you need to take time to ensure that all of the students have visual access to the math equation that's written on the board. And that's going to vary according to height, and so you have to consider that. And ensure that you shift your own body as you're talking about the equation that's on the board, and make eye contact with the students themselves, because that is how you know that they have access to both you and the information on the board. All right, so making sure that you're watching the students and that you are adjusting yourselves. Either you're turning your shoulders back, giving the students space to look at the math equation, or even bending down so that students have access to the information. And if the text is lower on the board, you can even lower your hand so that you're able to sign the equation right in proximity to where it's written on the board. So thank you very much for being a participant in our presentation today. I hope you all have a very nice day.